Geography is a cold, indifferent master, and tonight it has placed the world's jugular squarely under the blade. In the narrow, churning waters of the Strait of Hormuz, the rhetoric of diplomacy has been replaced by the raw math of kinetic energy. 100 miles of coastline, 20% of the world's oil, and a single ultimatum from Donald Trump that has stripped away the illusion of stability. We are no longer debating intent. We are measuring the velocity of escalation in a landscape where power is the only currency that survives the night. The map of the Persian Gulf is not a chart of nations, but a blueprint of vulnerabilities. To understand the current crisis, one must first understand the claustrophobia of the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, the shipping lanes are only 2 miles wide in either direction, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. For a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, an 1,100-foot sovereign piece of American territory, this is not an open sea. It is a shooting gallery. To the north, the Iranian coastline rises in jagged limestone massifs, providing the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps with high ground observation points that no amount of stealth technology can fully circumvent. This is a geographic prison for a blue water navy. The United States has built the most powerful expeditionary force in history, designed to project power across vast oceans. Yet here, in the shadow of the Musandam Peninsula, that power is compressed into a space so small that reaction times are measured in seconds rather than minutes. The crisis began not with a shot, but with a calculation of leverage. Iran's strategy has always been rooted in the realist doctrine of asymmetric deterrence. They know they cannot win a conventional fleet engagement against the U.S. Fifth Fleet. Instead, they have turned the strait into a minefield of area denial. By deploying thousands of smart mines, high-speed swarm boats, and shore-based anti-ship cruise missiles like the Noor and the Qadr, Tehran has created a situation where the cost of entry for the United States is potentially higher than the value of the objective. When Donald Trump issued his shock ultimatum, he was attempting to break this logic. His message was clear. The United States will no longer accept the cost of doing business in the Gulf. He has moved the goalpost from managed tension to total consequence. But in the world of great power realism, a threat only works if the geography allows you to carry it out without committing suicide. American force posture in the region is a massive interlocking grid of steel and silicon. From the Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid in Qatar to the naval hub in Manama, Bahrain, the U.S. maintains a ring of steel around the Iranian heartland. However, every one of these bases is within the envelope of lethality of Iran's ballistic missile arsenal. The Fateh 110 and the Zulfiqar missiles are not just weapons. They are political instruments designed to remind American allies in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi that the U.S. umbrella is made of fabric while the Iranian threat is made of iron. As Trump's ultimatum echoes through the halls of the Pentagon, the logistical reality sets in. To follow through on a strike, the U.S. must first suppress the most dense integrated air defense network in the Middle East. This is not a surgical strike scenario. This is the opening act of a theater-wide conflagration. Iran's initial moves in this crisis were not accidental. By seizing tankers and harassing commercial traffic, they were testing the structural integrity of the American security umbrella. They understand that for a maritime power like the United States, the freedom of navigation is not a moral preference, it is a survival requirement. If the U.S. cannot guarantee the safety of the sea lanes, the entire dollar-based global trade system begins to fracture. Iran's strategy is built on the logic of the weak against the strong. They do not need to win a naval battle. They only need to make the cost of transit unbearable. This is the essence of a choke point strategy. You don't need 1,000 ships. You just need to control the door. The American response, dictated by a commander-in-chief who views international relations through the lens of leverage and coercion, was a massive shift in force posture. The arrival of additional carrier strike groups and B-52 bombers is a signal of maximum pressure entering its kinetic phase. But as these steel giants move into the Gulf of Oman, they encounter the reality of Iranian A2, AD, anti-access, and area denial. The Iranian coastline is a honeycomb of underground missile silos and fast attack craft bases carved into the rock. Every move the U.S. makes is tracked by a network of coastal radars and drones that provide Iran with a home field advantage in the domain of ISR intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. The fog of war is thickening, but the cold calculus of the Pentagon and the IRGC remains transparent. This is no longer about a single tanker or a single tweet, but about who owns the right to define the limits of regional order. As the chess pieces of the Fifth Fleet align against the jagged coastline of the Islamic Republic, the question shifts from what has happened to who truly holds the terminal leverage in a theater where even a victory might be too expensive to afford. The reaction from Tehran has been a masterclass in calculated escalation. Instead of a direct strike on American warships, which would trigger an immediate and overwhelming kinetic response, Iran has chosen to activate its Ring of Fire, a network of proxies stretching from the Levant to the Bab el-Mandeb, by launching indirect fire against U.S. installations in Iraq and Syria. Iran is signaling that any strike on its soil will result in a multi-front war that the U.S. is not currently positioned to fight. This is the logic of horizontal escalation. If you hit me here, I will hit you everywhere else. It expands the battlefield from a 30-mile strait to a 3,000-mile arc of instability. Donald Trump's ultimatum, the promise that Tehran would become ashes if a single drop of American or allied oil was spilled, is an attempt at coercive deterrence. In the realist school, deterrence only works if the opponent believes you have both the capability and the will to execute the threat. By moving the assets into place, Trump has demonstrated capability. But will is a more volatile variable. The Iranian leadership is betting that Trump, despite his fiery rhetoric, is ultimately a transactional isolationist who does not want to be the president who started World War III in the Middle East. They are testing the threshold of his red line, pushing just far enough to inflict pain without crossing into the territory of total war. The point of maximum danger occurs when the logic of signaling fails. In this second act of the crisis, the U.S. has moved to decapitate Iran's ability to coordinate these attacks. The target is no longer just the missile launchers, but the C4ISR nodes, the command, control, and communication centers that allow the IRGC to synchronize its asymmetric swarm. This is a shift from defensive posturing to offensive counterforce. By targeting the brain of the Iranian military, the U.S. is attempting to paralyze their response. But in the cramped geography of the Gulf, a surgical strike is an oxymoron. Any attack on Iranian command centers is viewed by Tehran as the first step in a regime change operation, necessitating an all-out retaliatory launch. Logistics are the silent decider in this escalation. The U.S. military is a high-consumption machine. To maintain a carrier strike group in the Gulf of Oman requires a constant stream of fuel, munitions, and supplies. If Iran can successfully disrupt the logistics chain, not by hitting the carriers, but by hitting the tankers and supply ships that feed them, the American advantage in hard power begins to wither. We are seeing a contest between American technological supremacy and Iranian geographic endurance. Iran can wait. They are on their own soil. The U.S., operating thousands of miles from home, is on a ticking clock. This is the tyranny of distance versus the comfort of the coast. The logic of the surgical strike is the first casualty of this reality. In a high-intensity environment like the Persian Gulf, there is no such thing as a limited engagement. If the U.S. Air Force targets a missile battery on Qeshm Island, Iran must respond or lose its deterrent. If they respond by hitting a U.S. tanker, Trump must escalate to maintain his credibility. This is the escalation ladder. And in the Strait of Hormuz, the rungs are greased with oil. The United States is currently moving a massive amount of iron into the theater Patriot missile batteries, THAAD systems, and additional fighter squadrons. But logistics are the silent killer of grand strategies. The U.S. military requires a staggering amount of fuel and ammunition to sustain high-tempo operations. As we move toward the flashpoint, the role of intelligence and surveillance, C4ISR, becomes the primary battleground. The U.S. is currently blinded by the sheer volume of Iranian activity. Every fishing dhow could be a mine layer. Every cargo ship could be a floating launch pad for cruise missiles. This is environmental clutter, and Iran uses it to mask its intentions. The U.S. response has been to flood the area with ISR assets, from Global Hawk drones to underwater sensors. But in the narrow confines of the Gulf, the line between watching and targeting is non-existent. When a U.S. sensor locks onto an Iranian missile site, the Iranian commander sees a threat warning. He has seconds to decide, use it or lose it. The role of regional allies is the final variable in this act. Israel, viewing an American-Iranian conflict as a generational opportunity to neutralize the Iranian nuclear program, is pushing for a more aggressive posture. Meanwhile, the Gulf monarchies, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, find themselves in the crosshairs. Their entire economic infrastructure, from desalination plants to oil refineries, sits within range of Iranian short-range missiles. They want the U.S. to protect them, but they fear the consequences of an American strike that leaves them to face the Iranian backlash. This internal friction within the U.S. alliance structure is exactly what Tehran seeks to exploit. They are not just fighting the U.S. Navy. They are fighting the cohesion of the Western alliance. The threshold of no return is no longer a distant horizon, but a line drawn in the sand of the Arabian Peninsula, where the next move will determine the fate of the global energy supply for the next century. As the first cruise missiles leave their canisters and the first cyber attacks darken the grid, we are entering the final stage of a tragedy where the only exit is a fundamental realignment of the balance of power. The strategic turning point has arrived. If the United States follows through on Trump's ultimatum with a kinetic strike on Iranian soil, the old Middle Eastern order is officially dead. A strike of that magnitude would force Iran to utilize its ultimate deterrent, the total closure of the Strait of Hormuz via a massive mine and missile campaign. This is not just a military maneuver, it is an act of global economic sabotage. In a world of just-in-time manufacturing and razor-thin energy margins, the removal of Iranian and Gulf oil from the market would trigger a global depression that would dwarf the 1970s oil shocks. The cost of crude oil would not just rise. The market for it would simply cease to function in a predictable manner. The consequences for the balance of power would be permanent. China, the world's largest importer of Persian Gulf oil, would be forced to intervene, potentially moving its own naval assets into the Indian Ocean to secure its energy lifelines. This would mark the end of the U.S. as the sole guarantor of maritime security in the region. Russia, as a major oil exporter, would see its strategic leverage over Europe and Asia skyrocket as energy prices reach unprecedented levels. In trying to crush Iran, the U.S. might inadvertently accelerate the transition to a multipolar world where Washington no longer holds the keys to the global commons. We are looking at a scenario where the U.S. wins the battle but loses the system. Within the region, the fallout would be catastrophic for the current alliance structure. If the U.S. cannot prevent Iranian missiles from raining down on Riyadh or Abu Dhabi, the Gulf states will have no choice but to seek a new security arrangement, one that likely involves a massive accommodation with Tehran or a pivot toward Beijing as a mediator. The American Lake, as the Persian Gulf has been called for decades, would vanish. We would see the emergence of a new Persian hegemony hardened by conflict and no longer restrained by the threat of American intervention, because that threat would have already been spent. The credibility of American hard power would be tested and found lacking in its ability to protect its clients from the proximity of Iranian steel. The tactical reality of a post-strike environment is a nightmare of logistics. Clearing the Strait of Hormuz of smart mines and sunken tankers would take months, if not years, under constant fire. The U.S. Navy, designed for deep water engagement against peer competitors like China, is ill-equipped for a prolonged attritional mine-clearing operation in a littoral environment. Every day the strait remains closed, the Western alliance fractures further under the pressure of soaring inflation and social unrest. This is the logic of the cheaper escalation that Iran counts on. It costs them a few $1,000s to lay a mine. It costs the U.S. millions to find it, and the world billions in lost trade every hour it exists. Ultimately, the Trump ultimatum and the subsequent U.S. strike would prove that hard power has its limits when faced with the tyranny of geography. You can destroy an army and you can level a city, but you cannot easily change the fact that Iran sits on the porch of the world's most important hallway. The exit from this crisis will not be a victory parade. It will be a grim realization that the era of uncontested American hegemony in the Middle East has reached its kinetic conclusion. The new map will be drawn in the wreckage of the old, defined by new choke points, new alliances, and a much more dangerous distribution of power. The world would have to learn to live with a permanent state of high-intensity competition in the world's most vital energy artery. The petrodollar system, which has anchored the global economy since 1974, relies on the assumption that the U.S. military can and will protect the flow of oil from the Gulf. If the Strait of Hormuz is closed and the U.S. cannot reopen it through force, the fundamental value proposition of the U.S. dollar is undermined. We would see a rapid shift toward non-dollar oil trade led by China and India, effectively ending the U.S. ability to use economic sanctions as a primary tool of statecraft. This is the grand strategic consequence of a tactical failure in the Gulf. The weaponization of geography by Iran would lead to the de-weaponization of the U.S. financial system. As the smoke clears over the Gulf, the lesson for every global power is stark. In the theater of great power realism, an ultimatum is a double-edged sword. It can freeze an opponent in their tracks, or it can force them into a corner where their only option is to burn the house down with everyone inside. The world is now watching to see if the architect of the art of the deal has understood the one deal the geography of the Middle East never allows: a war without a price. The logic of power has been set in motion, and once the kinetic phase begins, the map, not the men, will decide the ending. The century of American dominance began with the control of the seas. It may well be challenged and fundamentally altered in a 30-mile stretch of water called Hormuz. The final realignment will not just be about who has the most ships, but about who can survive the collapse of the old order. In this new world, strategic depth is more valuable than tactical superiority. Iran, with its vast, mountainous interior and decentralized command structure, is built for this. The U.S. and its Gulf allies, with their hyper-concentrated wealth and fragile infrastructure, are not. The realist conclusion is cold and uncompromising. By issuing an ultimatum that forces a kinetic climax, the United States has gambled its entire global position on a theater where the house, represented by geography and asymmetric, will always has the advantage. The era of the shock ultimatum may have finally met its match in the reality of the choke point. The outcome of this confrontation will serve as a template for other global flashpoints, from the South China Sea to the Baltic. If the U.S. demonstrates that it can be deterred by the cost of escalation at Hormuz, other regional powers will adopt the Iranian model. We are looking at the dawn of the age of the choke point, where the global commons are no longer open, but are instead a series of toll booths guarded by regional actors with enough hard power to make the hegemon think twice. This is the ultimate realist endgame, a world where power is localized and the global order is nothing more than a fragile agreement between those who have the guns and those who have the maps. As the first missiles strike their targets and the world waits for the retaliatory swarm, the only certainty is that the Persian Gulf will never be an American lake again. The power balance has shifted, not because the U.S. became weaker, but because the world became more interconnected and thus more vulnerable to the disruption of its vital nodes. The Trump ultimatum was a roar of a fading era, trying to command the waves to stop, but the waves and the geography that shapes them do not listen to ultimatums. They only respond to the cold, hard logic of force and the endurance of those who call these waters home. The story of the coming war is not about who is right, but about who is left to dictate the terms of the peace that follows the ashes.